everybody, it is I, Captain Oblivious Mist, and today, folks, we're going to be doing the complete history of the Big Four. And by we're going to be doing the complete history of the Big Four, I mean I did this like months ago. As today, what I've done is I've decided to compile the series of videos I did on the Big Four from like September up until like April into a compilation of those videos in case you just want to watch them all at once and you don't want to go through my intro, epilogue, and all that jazz. So yeah, that is what I have done. But do not worry, if my SS Great Britain video isn't done by the end of the week, there will be a filler video out. Do not worry, this is not a main video, this is literally just a compilation I'm popping on my YouTube channel to make everybody's lives easier in case you wanted to watch them as a compilation. As well as that, do not worry, this video will not be replacing the actual series of videos I've got on my channel, not by a long shot. The series of videos will still be public to watch. As I said, this is just a compilation with some slight touches up to the Celtic video, i.e. there's now custom intertitles on it, little title screen. But yeah, that is it. So if you like watching the videos separately, do not worry, you can still watch them. They're on my YouTube channel. This is literally just if you wanted to watch them without going through the intros, the epilogues, you know, stuff like that. So anyways, now without any further ado, let's get into the video. Towards the end of the 1800s, the White Star Line had an idea to prioritise size and luxury over speed, leading to the construction of the Cymric and the Oceanic. During their construction, a new ship was planned. She was to be smaller than the Oceanic in length but bigger in tonnage. This would make her the first ship to be longer than the Great Eastern in tonnage, and the name of this new ship was to be Celtic. And on March 22nd, 1899, her keel was laid at the Harland and Wolff Yard at Belfast, Ireland, and on the 4th of April in 1901, the Celtic was launched, and was then fitted out on July of the same year, and she left Liverpool on her maiden voyage. And this would also be the very last ship that the White Star Line chairman, Thomas Ismay, father of the infamous Bruce Ismay, would see go into service, as unfortunately he died later that year. While I can't find much on her interior, I have heard and seen some things and photos of her interior, so this is all I know and have heard of. She had a massive, well I wouldn't say massive at the time, dining room with a majestic glass roof, and an amazing smoking room with stunning stained glass. As well as this, passengers also had access to things such as a library, a promenade deck, and a veranda cafe. All in all, she could carry up to 347 first class, 160 second class, and 2,350 third class passengers. As well as this, her outwards appearance bears many similarities to my favourite ship and the first subject of my Maritime Monday series, Oceanic, with her two funnels and the design of her bridge. There's obviously a few differences in the position of funnels, and though the bridge looks similar, I can't put my finger on it, but her bridge does have, and her forward superstructure does have a few differences compared to Oceanic. And as for her internal components though, she had two quadruple expansion steam engines that powered two propeller blades, giving her a surface speed of around 16 knots, which would later come in use for the next part. The Celtic made her maiden crossing on the 26th of July in 1901 between Liverpool and New York, which was rather uneventful, but they did realise that due to the size of the ship, the loading time of her in each port was an outrageously long time of 1 week, so chances of the White Star Line being in the speed race are slim to none. But her career was still pretty solid, apart from a few incidents, the first one of which being a collision with a steamer called the Heathmore. She somehow survived with a hole in her hull. Another incident was when a fire started in her cargo hold. Thankfully, it wasn't anything too severe, well, unless you were the cotton in her hold, to which then it would be a pretty bad time. And now we move on to a final one. As in Christmas of 1905, the Celtic was turned into Poseidon, and she was hit with a wave, only difference being that the Celtic was fine apart from a door and a glass panel in the second-class smoking room. Oh, and the obvious fact that Poseidon sunk, Celtic was fine. Anyways, even though the Celtic seems to be accident-prone, she still proved extremely popular, and in 1907 she was chartered out to another company, owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company. The American Line was the name of this company, and due to her success with the American Line, the White Star Line moved their operations to Southampton. Though these good times wouldn't last forever, as soon an Austrian Archduke was shot in Serbia, kick-starting the First World War, a time of complete and utter chaos and even more accidents for the Celtic. At the very beginning of the war, she was converted into an armed merchant cruiser. Though, due to my favourite ship, the Oceanic, and her grounding in 1914, proving the uselessness of an armed merchant cruiser, in 1916 it was announced she would be pulled out of service as an armed merchant cruiser, and she would instead be turned into a troop transport, and during this time a few mishaps happened, and one of these was when she struck a mine near the Isle of Man, and survived, but unfortunately 17 people died, and not long after that she was assigned to carry oil, and on March of 1918 she was hit with a torpedo, survived once again, though 3 people died, and not too long after that, of March the same year, the First World War came to an end, and in 1919, that's confusing, she was given back to the White Star Line, who sent her to Harland and Wolff. Unfortunately though, this would begin her final 9 years of life, as soon her accident proneness would catch up with her, as we'd see in the next section. After the war in 1920, she received a slight refit that brought down her third-class passenger capacity to 1,000 to help improve the quality of her accommodations. Now, as for the interesting stuff being her many accidents, the first one was in 1925, when she accidentally ran the ship the Hampshire coast while sailing around the River Mersey. And then, after this one, there was another incident when she lost a propeller blade in Boston, causing her passengers to take a train onto another ship. Oops. And then, she accidentally crashed into another ship called the Anaconda, near Fire Island, though these incidents were minor compared to her next one. But before that happened, she received yet another refit in 1927, resulting in first class being renamed as cabin class, and her prices were dropped to make up for her speed, as she was really slow, though this would be useless due to what would happen the very next year. On the 1st of December 1928, the RMS Celtic departed New York for what would be her final voyage, which went perfectly fine with no incident until the 9th of December when a storm rolled in. In fact, this storm was so bad that the Celtic decided to please forgive me for this pronunciation, Cobh, as the sea was so rough it was near impossible to meet her pilot vessel. Speaking of which, it didn't take long for the Celtic's pilot to realise the Celtic was missing off that port of call. So they went home, call blame them, leaving the Celtic all alone, and she continued forward through the weather until the seas and the weather had calmed down, causing the captain to decide to turn back and try and make the stop. This would prove fatal, as while she was waiting for another pilot, the weather decided to ramp up again. This time, it seems some unseen force didn't want the Celtic to escape, as this proved fatal due to the wind and the waves being particularly strong, in fact so strong she was knocked onto a bunch of rocks. Youch. After this, the crew assessed the damage, and after this was done, it was decided that the ship was in no immediate danger, and thus the next morning breakfast was served at 6 a.m. And not too long after that, a rescue effort was carried out by a bunch of lifeboats, tugs, and apparently some destroyers, though I don't think that's 100% accurate, because why the hell would a destroyer help a civilian liner not in wartime? But apart from that, you may now be asking, why didn't they pull her off the rocks and return into service? Well, that, my dear viewer, is because the insurance company that assessed her quite rightly said she wasn't worth it, and if they did pull her off the rock, she'd probably sink. So it was decided that she was going to be abandoned and scrapped, which was completed by 1933, bringing her long and amazing career to an end. My ending thoughts of the Celtic after doing the video on her is she had an amazing career. It was very long and very eventful, and apparently there must have been some unseen force looking out for her due to the amount of collisions she'd had. It's kind of coincidental how, despite the collisions she had, she'd survived this long, especially to say she was the first ship of a class of 4, which I do plan to do the other 4 in a future video, more on that in a minute. Her career was long and nice. She was a beautiful ship, and in my opinion she has cemented herself into my 10 favourite ships, and if I ever do a remake of that list, she would be in it. And it's a shame that she is never really spoken about in history books, despite being Ismay's final ship. As you may remember from my previous video on the Big Four, at the beginning of the 20th century, the White Star Line wanted a new ship to compete with the Cunard Line and the Germans, so they began talks with Harland and Wolff. Their new ship was called Celtic, and she was going to be the first of her class, as during her construction, a keel of her sister ship was laid. Her name was to be Cedric. She was designated Yard number 337, and she was launched on the 21st of August 1902 in a private ceremony, which was great for me, as not too long after her launch, one of my favourite photos are taken. The photo, which should be on screen now, if all goes well, has White Star Line's aging ship SS Britannic, which would be scrapped soon, next to the unfinished Cedric, which, looking at the photo, shows a huge size difference. But back to the video, as a month later, her sister ship, the RMS Baltic, began construction. But this isn't her video, this is the Cedric's, so let's get on to the Cedric's interior, as she had pretty similar interiors to the Celtic, as they both had a beautiful smoking room topped with an amazing glass dome with perfect open promenades. She also boasted a reading and writing room. As well as this, she had her own orchestra. Nice. But a big difference between the Celtic and the Cedric is the lifeboat davits, as Cedric was one of the first ships to use the brand new well-and-tight davits. Now, as for how the ship would move, she would use 2 propellers powered by quadruple expansion machines, giving her a surface speed of 16 knots, and she consumed considerably less coal than her competitors. Extremely useful for her maiden voyage, bringing me to the next part. She was delivered on the 31st of January 1903, and she then made her maiden voyage on the 11th of February, and with her introduction, the need for the SS Britannic was low, and thus the SS Britannic was sent to the shipbreakers. But as for the Cedric, she began her career, and, well, to begin with, it was rather uneventful. Apart from a few events, including on March 15th when a measles epidemic broke out, and to make matters worse, she was caught in a storm, which took her bell.
and panicked the passengers even more. Yeah, that sounds like a pretty horrible voyage. But then, in 1910, the Cedric caught fire. Thankfully, she was fine. I mean, this video has got a while left, so I guess you can imagine so. And then, 2 years later, she was involved in the Titanic saga, as Bruce May wanted to use her to bring back the Titanic's crew to England. Though these attempts were futile, as most of the Titanic's remaining crew and passengers was brought back to Britain via the Cedric's younger sister, the Adriatic. But this isn't a video on the Titanic or the Adriatic, so back to the Cedric, as soon Europe would be plunged into a massive war, and with it came the Cedric. The Cedric was one of the first ships to be requisitioned by the British Admiralty, along with her fleetmates, the Teutonic, Oceanic and Celtic. She was assigned to patrol near Norway with the aforementioned Teutonic, though this didn't last long as she was way too big, and thus she was reassigned as a troop ship in 1916. And with this, she travelled to areas she was never meant to go, including Palestine and Egypt. Though this wasn't an accident-free time, as she had a few incidents, including the 1st of July 1917, when she collided with a French schooner, which I'm not even going to bother pronouncing her name. Then, to make matters worse, in 1918, the Cedric collided with the Montreal of the Canadian Pacific Line. The Montreal survived and almost made it back to be repaired. Then she sunk 14 minutes away from a light vessel. Ooh, I bet that was annoying. But back to the video, as not too long after the armistice was signed in 1919, the Cedric caught fire yet again. Thankfully though, she survived, making it possible for her to be returned to the White Star Line, bringing me to her post-war career. Cedric was given back to the White Star Line not too long after the fire, and as soon as she was returned to the White Star Line, she was sent to Harland and Wolff for a refit. Similar to the one the Celtic had around this time, it brought down the passenger capacity. And as well as this, when she returned to passenger service, she was filling in for the new ships that White Star was awaiting for, Majestic and Homeric, and instead of her usual Liverpool to New York route, she was serving Southampton to New York. Though this didn't last, as these two new ships that the White Star was awaiting finally arrived in 1922, and thus she resumed service in Liverpool. Though similar to her sister ship the Celtic, the Cedric had a few incidents around this time. First one being a collision with Cunard's Scythia. Both ships made it out fine. In fact, they made it out so fine, I guess you could say they were in ship shape. Get it? Anyways, back to the video. As on 26th of December 1924, the Cedric caught fire yet again, destroying all of her cotton in her cargo hold, also similar to the Celtic. But the final incident was when the Cedric collided with the river vessel Van in the Boston harbour, severely damaging the poor vessel. Times were starting to look grim for the Cedric, especially when the Great Depression hit and two new, more economical ships called the MV Britannic and MV Georgic was introduced. This proved to be the final straw, and in 1931 the Cedric was sold to the shipbreakers, to which then she was completely scrapped by 1932, bringing an end to the second ship of the Big Four. I've already said this twice now, so to stop these videos intros from becoming the same thing just longer each time, I have decided to speed this up, so let's get into it. As back in the late 1800s, the White Star Line designed a new ship that was to be the biggest in the world. This ship was to be called Celtic, and during her construction, the second ship of the Big Four had her keel laid, and during the construction of this second ship, which was to be called Cedric, the White Star decided that they would need a third ship in this class, and so, a month after her older sister was launched, the keel of this new ship was laid, beginning the construction process. Also, beginning the complete story of the RMS Baltic. The new ship was going to be called Baltic, and she'd be the second White Star ship to bear that name, and her yard number was 337. Now, during her construction, the White Star Line decided that they wanted the RMS Baltic to be the biggest ship in the world. Now, to make this dream a reality, they would have to make her hull longer, but there was one teensy-tiny little problem. Her hull was already built. So in a moment that probably made someone scream, they decided to cut open the Baltic's hull and extend her. But on the bright side, at least she'd be given an extra 3,000 tons in the process. Now, as for interiors, she had pretty similar ones to her sisters, so to stop this video from becoming a repeat of the other two videos, I'm just gonna move on to the next part, as on the 21st of November 1903, she was launched. And on the 24th of June the following year, the RMS Baltic was handed over to her brand new owners, and she made her way to Liverpool to start her maiden voyage. On the 29th of June 1904, the Baltic completed her maiden voyage under the command of the future captain of the RMS the Titanic, Edward John Smith. Now, you may remember earlier when I mentioned the Baltic being expanded during her construction. Well, due to this, the Baltic had a few slight technical difficulties that brought down the Baltic's speed. But either way, the Baltic served on the Liverpool to New York route. During this time, she proved popular with passengers, but her early career wasn't all sunshine and lollipops, as she had a few accidents. For example, in May of 1905, her machinery broke down, causing a slight delay of 6 hours. Then, on the 3rd of November, one of the Baltic's cargo holds caught fire, which was thankfully put under control, but unfortunately, the cotton in her hold was destroyed. Another incident was in 1907 when the Baltic collided with a barge full of coal, and then, in 1909, she caught fire yet again, causing $10,000 worth of damage. Soon after, the Republic would be in the limelight, but for a different reason. On the 23rd of January 1909, the RMS Republic was rammed by the Italian ship the Florida. Now, you might be wondering, what has this got to do with the Baltic? Well, you see, her wireless operator, Jack Binns, sent out a CQD message which the Baltic picked up and came to the aid of the Republic by taking the passengers off of the Florida, and because of this, when the Republic sunk, she had no casualties apart from the initial people lost in the collision. On the 10th of April 1912, the RMS Titanic left Southampton for New York, and during her maiden voyage she received many ice warnings from many ships, including the subject of our video, the Baltic. But despite everything, the Titanic collided with an iceberg, fatally wounding her, causing her to sink. But the ice warning was not the end of the Baltic's involvement in the sinking. And in fact, during the sinking, the Titanic sent out distress signals, and one of the ships to respond to the distress signals was the Baltic. But unfortunately, she was too far away to make it to the sinking liner, and the aftermath of the sinking led to the Baltic being given extra lifeboats. But time would soon prove that the Baltic would have much bigger things to worry about. As I've said a million times before this video, in 1914 an Austrian Archduke was shot in Serbia, plunging Europe into World War I. And due to this, the British government had the right to requisition any ship registered to a British port, including the Baltic. But she wasn't requisitioned straight away, and for a short period of time she continued her normal service, until late 1914, where on one of her early voyages as an auxiliary cruiser, she collided with another ship at the exit of the Ambrose Channel. Then, in 1915, the Baltic was requisitioned as a troop ship, which was pretty uneventful until the 26th of April 1917, when a German U-boat tried to torpedo her, but failed miserably, and then started a pursuit with the Baltic, which eventually ended with the Baltic coming off unscathed. And then, in June of the same year, the Baltic would transport General John J. Pershing to England. Afterwards, she was awarded a plaque for this event, which would be on display in her dining room. Then, on the 11th of November 1918, the First World War came to an end. The Baltic would not be returned to her owners until December of that year. In 1921, the Baltic underwent a refit, which brought down her capacity for third-class passengers due to a drop in their numbers. Then, in 1924, the Baltic's boilers were replaced with new ones. Very interesting, I know. Then, in 1927, she was given a brand new tourist class to modernise her. She wasn't the only one of her class to receive this change, as her three other sisters was also given the same change. The Baltic would then again come to the rescue of another ship in 1929 as a schooner called the Northern Light was sinking. When the Baltic caught wind of it, she sailed over to the aid of the schooner. Then a month later, she collided with her dock, damaging one of her propeller blades, which took 9 hours to repair. But these times wouldn't last, as in 1929 the White Star Line was plunged into a crisis caused by the Great Depression. Then, to make matters worse for the Baltic, a newer, more economical ship joined the White Star fleet called the Britannic, and with the Baltic's passenger numbers dwindling, the White Star Line decided to sell the Baltic, and in 1933 she was sold to some Japanese shipbreakers along with the Megantic. The Baltic left for a final voyage to Osaka in February of the same year, where she would be broken up, which was finished by 1934, ending the life of the third ship in the Big Four, and my personal favourite ship of her class. During the late 1800s, the White Star Line needed a new ship to compete with the Cunard Line. So enter the Celtic. She came in around 20,000 gross registered tons and was the biggest ship in the world, as well as a huge success for the White Star Line. So they decided to build a sister ship for the Celtic. This sister ship was to be called the Cedric, and during the construction of the sister ship, the construction on the third ship in this class begun, when her keel was laid down, and this ship was to be called the Baltic. And during her construction, the keel for the fourth and final ship in the Big Four, as well as the subject of today's video, was laid. This ship would be the most luxurious and revolutionary liner in the Big Four, and she was to be called the RMS Adriatic. The Adriatic was slightly bulkier than the rest of the Big Four. She was also the largest of her class, but not in the world. If you're wondering why, well, we'll get into that later, as like the rest of the Big Four, she was powered by quadruple expansion engines, giving her a slightly faster service speed of 17 knots. Another section where she was superior compared to her sisters was her interiors, as she had a gorgeous dining room that had an amazing glass roof, and a smoking room adorned with stained glass. She was also the first ship to have Turkish baths. She was also the first ship, maybe not the first ship to have a swimming pool, but she was the first ship that was given a swimming pool that didn't sink, as ships were given swimming pools for centuries, but they were not meant to be there. Enough of the joking around, as we need to cover the construction process itself, which began when she was ordered in 1903. But despite this, she wouldn't be launched until the 20th of September 1906, which was on the same day as the Cunard Line's Mauritania's launch day, which resulted in the Adriatic being the only ship in her class not to be the biggest ship in the world. But on another note, after her launch, she was put into dry dock and completed. Then, in April of 1907, she was handed over to the White Star Line and then sailed to Liverpool to begin her maiden voyage. When she left on a maiden voyage, she left with great fanfare and under the command of the future captain of the RMS Titanic, Captain Edward John Smith. But unlike the Titanic 5 years later, The Adriatic arrived in New York on the 16th of May 1907, and shortly after she was transferred to the Southampton to New York route. During this time, a few incidents happened, one of which was on the 10th of October 1908, when the fact that 4 crew members had stolen £4,000 worth of passenger luggage had been brought up to light. Another incident was in 1909, when the Adriatic ran aground in the Ambrose Channel. Then, in 1910, her stokers mutinied. As well as that, in 1910, a passenger died. This passenger was called Alexander Agassiz. I ain't bothering to pronounce that last name. Very random and not very interesting, I know, but Wikipedia found it interesting enough to put it on the website, so hey ho. Anyways, in 1911, the Olympic was completed, resulting in the Adriatic being moved back to the Liverpool to New York route. Then, in 1912, the RMS Titanic was completed and left on a maiden voyage, which ended when she had a love tap with an iceberg and sunk, resulting in some of the surviving passengers needing to go back to Britain. And so, the Adriatic came to the rescue, sort of, and transported some of the passengers back to Britain. Now, not much really happened after this until World War I, which brings me to the next part of the video. In 1914, a massive war broke out between many of the great European powers, which resulted in many White Star Line ships being requisitioned. But thankfully for the Adriatic and her older sister, the Baltic, they were not requisitioned, and in fact continued on their normal route. They were even joined by 3 ships from the Red Star Line. These ships were the Vaderland, or is it the Vaderland? I don't know. Zealand and the Lapland, but unfortunately for the Adriatic, she was eventually requisitioned by the British government on the 12th of April 1917, and at some point during this time, while docked in Pier 60, some oil barrels on a deck caught fire. Thankfully though, the firefighters on the scene got the fire under control and eventually put the fire out, making the next part of her career possible, as in the 11th of November 1918, the First World War finally came to an end.
On the 3rd of September 1919, the Adriatic returned to service with the Red Star Line's Lapland, which was filling in for the Olympic, and this would last until 1921, when the Adriatic was pulled from service for a refit. And after this, she returned to the Liverpool to New York route with her sisters. But disaster would soon strike the Adriatic, as on the 10th of August 1922, the Adriatic was a victim of a gas explosion which took 5 lives and blew the hatch off her cargo hold. Then, to make matters worse, she then caught fire, but thanks to a second engineer, James Corrigan, and many other brave souls, the fire was eventually put out, and she was able to make it to New York, where temporary repairs were made, before she then left on a return voyage to have more permanent repairs done. After this was completed, she returned to service on the 19th of August, and during this time, the Adriatic and her 3 sisters made regular stops in Boston, and in her later life, she began doing more cruises than usual. After returning from the Mediterranean in 1928, she had a refit, which converted her into a cabin-class ship, and in this role, she proved popular, but nothing good lasts forever, and that goes the same for the Adriatic. In 1929, thanks to a little thing known as the Great Depression, cruising became less profitable. So the Adriatic was laid up during the winter and was mainly used during the summer. Then, to add another nail into the coffin, the White Star Line's 2 new, more economical ships, the Britannic and Georgic, was completed. To try and combat her increasingly rising uselessness, she went on experimental low-cost cruises, which failed, resulting in the Adriatic September cruises being cancelled. Then, on the 24th of February 1934, the Adriatic made her last transatlantic crossing. Then, what would be the final nail in the coffin was, well, nailed in the coffin, as in the spring of 1934, the White Star Line and the Cunard Lines merged, resulting in the Adriatic joining the merged company's new fleet. But this didn't last long, as at this point the Adriatic was aging severely, so in September of 1934 she was immobilized and sold to Japanese shipbreakers. She then left on her longest voyage from Liverpool to Osaka, Japan, where she was broken up, ending the life and the career of this legendary liner and the final ship of the Big Four.